My name is Annette Gordon-Reed. I'm introducing myself. I'm a professor here at the law school, and I'm also a professor in the history department at Harvard. So I have a joint appointment, and I teach classes sometimes solely over here and sometimes solely over there. And sometimes I do joint classes, classes together with law students and graduate students, and sometimes undergrads mixed in. I'm doing a freshman seminar this semester on Jefferson and Hamilton, which is turning out to be quite nice. Can't get them into the play, but I did my best. But we'll try to come up with something that might be almost as good as that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, my most recent book. It's called Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. I first want to start off to talk about the title. There was some concern in my publishing house about the title patriarch, of the word patriarch in the book, and blessed patriarch, because it sounded quite religious, and people weren't certain that whether or not readers or potential readers would would not think that this was about a religious figure, even though it's Thomas Jefferson, obviously not a religious figure. I was a bit concerned about, I like the phrase most blessed of the patriarchs. I was concerned that people would think that Peter and I, my co-author, Peter Schiff, who is a professor, was the Thomas Jefferson professor at the University of Virginia, that we were calling him the most blessed of the patriarchs. And we insisted that the phrase be in quotations, because that is a quote from Jefferson himself. That's a phrase that he used to describe himself. He was, and I'll give you the context, he was writing a letter to a woman named Angelica Schuyler Church, who many people who've listened to the Hamilton cast album or who actually saw the play will recognize as Angelica Schuyler, one of the Schuyler sisters. And she was someone who Jefferson met when he was in Paris. She was the sister-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. So in the small world, the way that these things go, Jefferson and Hamilton were in Washington's cabinet after Jefferson returned from Paris. They started out okay and then ended up as sort of enemies, bitter political rivals. And their rivalry is something that has sort of sparked controversy on both sides. People who are partisans of Hamilton, people who are partisans of Jefferson, they've come to, in a sort of a caricature way, represent two understandings about the future of America: an agricultural nation or a nation of manufacturing, industrialists and manufacturing. So that's Hamilton wasn't against farmers, and Jefferson really was not against manufacturing. He just thought that that was something that was going to come at a later stage. But that's the battle that people, the battle lines that people draw when they're thinking about the two of them. So Jefferson and Hamilton are in the cabinet. They are fighting, and they're fighting for Washington's favor. And in the end, Hamilton wins. And Jefferson decides that he has to resign. And before he leaves, he sits down to write a letter, and he writes this letter to Angelica Schuyler Church, and he's talking about going back to Monticello, and I have my fields to farm and so forth, and to watch for the happiness of those who labor for mine, namely enslaved people. And he says, I have my daughters who are going to be living next to me, and one daughter who's living next to me, if the other one joins me, I will consider myself as blessed as the most blessed of the patriarchs. And so that's where that phrase comes from. And there's another letter that he writes a couple of years later in which he describes himself as living at Monticello like an antediluvian patriarch. So this word patriarch comes back a couple of times in the way he describes himself. And it's half serious, but it's like, I would say, maybe two-thirds serious, because he is sort of a patriarch. And we sort of thought, how can we explain this? How do we look at a person who considers himself a Democrat, a Republican Democrat, a person who was for the people, who championed the common man, who eventually thought that his kind, his class of people would die out, and America would be replaced by middle class or yeoman farmers, is the way it's typically described. And yet he calls himself a patriarch. And when you think of patriarch, as I said, you think of a religious figure. You certainly think of something from long ago. a long time ago. And a patriarch has power over everybody, power over a family, perhaps power over a region. Again, it sort of goes against this notion of a democrat in the way we construct our understanding of a person who is interested in the popular will or sees himself as somebody who's promoting the popular will. So we decided to write a book about Jefferson that tried to explain this paradox, and we think we have explained him. There's a tendency, Peter and I think, to write about Jefferson as if he were this inscrutable person. He's called a sphinx in one particular book. He's an impenetrable man. But he's impenetrable if you approach the subject thinking that with a certain set preconceived notions about what it means to be a patriarch, what it means to be a democrat. And if you approach it from the standpoint of doing away with chronology, not thinking about the various stages of Jefferson's life, what really happens very often is that Jefferson will say something or do something, and people will reach back to a letter from, if he does something, say, in 1817, they'll reach back for a letter from 1803 or 1789 to explain that action. And if you think about the stages of anybody's life, or all of our lives, we change. We have different answers to things based upon what stage where we are. We have different answers to questions when we have a particular context in mind, a particular set of problems and situations. There's no one continuing person. I mean, the essence of the person is there, but the experiences change the person. I had the experience of, I kept a diary when I was in college at Dartmouth, and a few years back, I was sort of going through things, and I found it, and I was reading it, and I was aghast, it's like, do I keep this? Do I throw it away? What do I do with this? Because I recognized this person. It was the same person in some ways, but it was a different person. I had not been married then. I didn't have children. I hadn't lost parents. I hadn't had a real job. All the kinds of things that go into helping to shape who you are. So what we wanted to do was to look at Jefferson anew, as much as that could possibly be done. So much has been written about him. Maybe more has been written about Lincoln. Maybe more biographies, more books about Lincoln, but Jefferson is probably a close second. So much has been written about him. We've written a lot about him, and we wanted to do this to try to bring a fresh perspective on someone who we think is continuing and continues to be a lightning rod even today. Now, when we first started writing this book, Hamilton the play was nowhere on the horizon. And we had no idea that anybody would know who Angelica Schuyler Church was. And it's funny, when we give talks about this now, people know who she is, and that wouldn't have happened without Lin-Manuel Miranda. And only people who read many people read the biography of Hamilton that Rod Chernow wrote, but not as a matter of popular knowledge. The other thing that wouldn't have happened is that we didn't realize that there were going to be all of these controversy about monuments and statues and his role and the role of other people in American life, and so memorializing people in American life. So the funny thing about writing a book is you never know what world you're going to release it into. You start out in one point, and then by the time it comes out, and sometimes if you're lucky, you hit a moment that's really good, and then that helps it. And if you're unlucky, then the opposite is the case. But here, I think we're lucky because he is a topic of conversation, and we have something, I think, to say about that. Now, Peter and I, how did I come to write a book with a person? Historians don't typically collaborate. Writers are usually pretty possessive and are interested in, there's sort of an ego involved in this. But I wanted to do a book with Peter because he was about to retire from the University of Virginia. I wasn't really too keen on that, not that it was my business to make that kind of judgment, but I thought this would be a sort of final time to be able to talk with him, and to bring the kind of conversation that we'd been having about Jefferson since 1997 to other people. Peter was one of the first people to read my first book, the manuscript that I wrote. I took it down there to him because he was the Thomas Jefferson Foundation professor. It was a book about the controversy whether Jefferson had had a long-term liaison, and we could talk about what we call this later on, with Sally Hemings. And I sort of assumed that because of who he was, he would not like what I was saying. And if you're writing something that you know is going to be controversial, I think it's better to go give it to someone who you think might be opposed to you, as opposed to an amen corner. I wanted people who would be against the thesis, and my thesis was that historians had given short shrift to the idea, and that they had put a thumb on the scale, arguing that Jefferson did not have this connection to Sally Hemings. So that's how I met Peter in 1995, I should say. And the book came out in 97, but I met him in 1995. And we've had this ongoing conversation and friendship and talking about Jefferson. And so I wanted to put that on paper for other people to see the kind of conversation that we've been having. We also determined that after we were going to call it this and we were going to give a new look, we were going to suggest that what we thought would be useful would be to take Jefferson, and I say this in the book, take Jefferson whenever it is possible, reasonable to do so, to take him at his word. So much of what happens, has happened, is that there's been so much writing about him that people have a tendency to write with undue skepticism. Skepticism about subjects is good. I mean, you have to think about what people are saying and question it and determine whether it's truthful or not. But there was sort of an excessive of skepticism. It seemed that people were writing to kind of show how wise they were. I know you. I've got you down. I know your number, and I'm not going to be taken in by you. Rather than thinking about what he's saying and looking around it, the context, to see whether or not it makes any sense. So the idea was to take him seriously on these notions when it is at all reasonable. Sometimes it's not reasonable, just like with anybody else. But that was the project. We decided not to do sort of a cradle-to-grave look at him, but we were going to look at certain themes and to try to describe the things that were important to him. And we start off talking about patriarch is the word. We have 3 sections. We talk about the patriarch, and talk about his beginnings and how he came to be the person he was. Patriarch, in our mind, we talk about the patriarchy is 100%, well, maybe, I don't want to speak for people, but a negative thing. It's the thing we're trying to defeat, right? In his time, a patriarch was a person who had a lot of power, but he also thought of himself as having responsibilities. Now that, sets our teeth on edge because it's, responsibilities. We'll let these people decide on their own. let them have their own lives. You don't have to look after anybody. Why do you think that? But for him, he had power, but he also had responsibilities. So we start out with patriarch to determine how this individual came to be the man that he was. He was born in Virginia at probably the highest station in society that you could have at that point for what passed as aristocrats in Virginia. His father was a self-made man who wasn't a large landowner or large slaveholder, but his mother was a member of something called the Randolph family in Virginia. And it was a very old and a very large family. Jefferson was a Randolph. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, was his cousin, was part of the Randolph family. And then there's John Randolph, of course, who was a somewhat eccentric legislator in Virginia at the time. So this family had a lot of influence. And his mother gave him status. His mother's side of the family gave him status. He had all the kinds of things that would go into making a person self-assured and think of himself as a patriarch, someone who could be he would say a master of people. He was, as I said, born in a high social class. He was given the best education that people could get in Virginia at the time. He was tall at a time when that meant something. It was unusual He was the firstborn son, when that meant something as well. And he was white. He was literally the master of, he owned people. His family did. And he grew up also thinking of himself as a member, as an adherent to something called the Enlightenment. So he has all of these advantages, but these advantages don't make him into a conservative. They make him into somebody, in his personality, made him into somebody who saw himself as a progressive and an adherent to the Enlightenment. He loved to read and he loved science. And so adherence to the Enlightenment had certain ideals that they believed in, and one of them, well, there are several of them. One of them was skepticism about religion, skepticism about, I should say, the established church and priests and people whom he thought controlled others for their own benefit. Adherence to the Enlightenment, believed in science. Jefferson had a complete faith in the idea of science, an almost too great faith in science, in the sense that he not only saw it in terms of how we think of scientific experiments and so forth, but he thought that science, I mean, he likened life to science in a way, that politics and those kinds of things. The world was scientific in the sense that eventually people would get better and better. Things would get better and better. There would always be progress. So he believed in progress in a way that maybe we don't, that we sort of know a little bit better, that things don't always walk forward straight, better and better and better. It's, you know, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back sometimes, 2 steps sideways or whatever. But he believed that things would get better and better. So this notion of progress is something that was a part of his makeup. Anti-slavery. As a young man, in his 20s, he writes in his commonplace book. These are little books that people kept with sayings and so forth, things that they would clip out. He clipped out a poem from a man named William Shenstone about the slave trade and about a man, an African, ripped from his homeland, forced across the ocean to labor for other people. Now, so for people who say, well, Jefferson is doing all this anti-slavery talk just for posterity, for legacy, this is when he's like 25, 26. There is no Thomas Jefferson. I mean, there was a Thomas Jefferson, but he wasn't Thomas Jefferson at that time. He doesn't know there's going to be a United States of America. He doesn't know he's going to be president of it. I mean, this is part of this Enlightenment notion. I am the young progressive person. He believes from the very beginning that slavery is wrong, and he writes that from an early period of his life. So those are that's the kind of person he starts off as an individual who is, thinks that he's going to be one of the leading people in his society, but he's going to be helping towards moving Virginia's society into a more progressive view. Then the Revolution comes along, and he's a young man. He's a young lawyer. I have a friend who's doing a book now about Jefferson as a young lawyer, and he talks about his cases. Some of his cases were cases that involved slavery or freeing, defending people or working on behalf of people who were claiming their freedom. And he did things as a lawyer to try to move that along. But the Revolution comes, and he develops a new passion. At first, as you may know, the revolutionaries were not really interested in leaving Great Britain. They just wanted the king and the parliament to make reforms. Eventually, they decide they want to make a break. And when that happens, Jefferson really, really began to hate Great Britain. Before he had loved, he grew to hate it in the way that you could only hate something that you had really loved at one point. And he was against the British. He writes the Declaration. It's not known at that time that he's writing the Declaration. That is something that became much more known later in the 1790s. But he, among the people in the know, understood what he did. And the Revolution becomes the focal point of his life. This is the thing that we say in the book. We're obsessed with race, rightly, I think. We are obsessed with the issue of slavery, which I think is right. But that was not Jefferson's obsession, neither one of those things. Jefferson was obsessed about the United States of America. The Revolution having been a part of the revolution, having helped to create a country, and then once the country is created, how do I maintain? How do you maintain that country in the face of what he thought were counter-revolutionaries like Alexander Hamilton? I mean, we laugh about that, but I mean, you think about it, you have a revolution. Every revolution has a counter-revolution. There are going to be people who are opposed to it, and he saw Hamilton's intense focus on saying that the Great Britain's Constitution was the best constitution that ever existed, his militarism, his notion that the president should serve for life and that the Senate should serve for life. He thought that Hamilton was trying to bring British influence, British projects into America. And so he thinks that this is the counter-revolution. So I'm saying this to say that this is the difficult thing about writing history and reading history, is to accept that people in the past, their categories are not our categories. The things that we're interested in, they may not be so interested in. And we say, don't you see? It's like yellow fever. You read these stories about yellow fever in the 1790s, and you want to say to people, okay, what comes every summer? It's around water. It goes away in the wintertime. I mean, what could it be? I mean, mosquitoes, maybe, but they're not ready. That's not the way they thought about things, or they would ever have thought of that. So he is interested in the revolution, and that is the most important thing of his life. And if you understand that, I think you understand a lot about Jefferson. So the book starts off talking about the patriarch, the young man who gets involved in the revolution, and this is the central focus of his life from that moment on until the end of his life, that he is trying to protect what he thinks he has helped to create. That's the first part of the book. Then the second part of the book, Traveler, goes to the idea. It goes to, has Jefferson going to France and shows how the ideas that he developed there, the ideas that he saw, the things he saw there, helped to transform him. He is, when he leaves, he has been the governor of Virginia, very poor governor. I mean, things didn't work out so well. He's angry at the people who were mad at him about some of the things that he did as governor. And he goes to France, and he sees a completely different world. He loves part of it. He loves the art, the music, the architecture, but he's frightened of the social life in France. And what frightens him the most are women. Women in France who are talking politics, who are, he says, in the streets, away from the nurseries, forgetting what they've left behind in their nurseries and their husbands and so forth. So French family life scares him. And he thinks that, this is women out of control, it's anarchy. This is a problem. This is part of the patriarchy stuff, right? The patriarch theme. But this is strange when you think about it, because he has a very weird family. It's a very weird family. Why, in the midst of being a revolutionary, before he becomes a full-fledged revolutionary, he marries a woman named Martha Whale Skelton. She is a widower. She's a widow. Her husband has died, Reuben Skelton. He marries her, and when he marries into that family, he marries into a family in which his father-in-law, John Wales, had 6 children with an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings. So Jefferson and Martha get married. When John Wales dies, the Hemings family, these 6 children, come to live with them at Monticello. So, you think about this situation. Martha, many white women whose husbands and fathers had children, husbands and fathers or sons had children with enslaved women, very often made them sell the kids. Or they would certainly put them away somewhere. Martha brings these people to live in her house. And Jefferson has a manservant, a man named Jupiter Evans, who had been with him since he was a kid. And we actually think that Jupiter's mother was Jefferson's wet nurse. They were born the same year, and they were together companions the whole time. He substitutes Jupiter, who had been traveling with him, for Robert Hemings, who would have been his wife's half-brother. He was 12 at the time. So a man who's 30 is substituted by a 12-year-old boy as valet. And Robert travels with Jefferson all along the Eastern Seaboard. He's there when he's in Philadelphia writing the Declaration of Independence. So a strange family. I mean, to someone complaining about or interested in French families, to have married into this kind of situation, that's sort of hard for us to imagine, to have your sisters and your brothers as people whom you own. And we'll never know what the nature of their relationship was. We do know that Robert Hemings, we don't know if Sally Hemings was literate, or we have no letters or anything from her, but Robert Hemings, her brothers, Robert and James and Peter, Robert and James definitely, we know, could read and write. Robert's correspondence with Jefferson in the 1790s is missing. It's one of those things a historian you would love to have, those letters, to see how they talked to each other, what he said. James Hemings was also literate, and at a pretty high level. We have a list of cooking utensils that he made, of the sort of inventory of the things they brought back from France, and the handwriting is beautiful, and it's, spelling is fine, is great. So who did that? So we don't know. Who taught them how to read and write? Was it Martha who taught them how to read and write? But her connection to them, when she dies, her sisters, her full sisters and sister-in-laws, and her enslaved half-sisters are around the bed, and she gives Sally Hemings a memento, a bell, to remember her by. And so they're all around the bed with Jefferson as the only guy there. And this is the scene. This is the weird family scene. So he's in France thinking French families are strange, but he's got a pretty strange family on his own. So when he goes to France, he takes with him James to teach him how to have him taught to be a French chef, and he takes his eldest daughter. A couple of years later, he's left two daughters behind, and he's left them at a place called Eppington with Betsy Epps, who is his sister-in-law. He leaves them there with Sally Hemings, who is at this time about 10 years old. So Sally Hemings is there with little girls who are her half-nieces and with her half-sister. It's a very convoluted situation. That's why I have a family tree in the Hemings of Monticello, so everybody can keep it straight. One of the girls dies, one of Jefferson's daughters dies, and then he says, "Send my other daughter to me." He wanted her to come to France. And he said, "Send her with a careful Negro woman, such as Isabel." And he means Isabel Hearn, who was about 28 years old. Isabel is pregnant, and they don't want to send her, so they send Sally Hemings over. At the time, she's 14 years old, and she is the nursemaid or companion to Jefferson's 10-year-old daughter. They go across the ocean, and she's not supposed to stay. Isabel was supposed to come, drop Polly off, and go back to Virginia. When Sally Hemings comes, she doesn't go back, and we don't know why she doesn't go back. I talk in the Hemings of Monticello and a little bit in this book about why it would have been a mistake to do that, to send a 14-year-old girl back on a ship with a bunch of sailors for 5 weeks. But she ends up staying in Paris. And at some point, Madison Hemings, the man who was their son, says, during that time, my mother became Mr. Jefferson, because everybody called him Mr. Jefferson, his grandchildren, his daughters, everybody, particularly if they're talking to other people. She became Mr. Jefferson's concubine. And while she's there, she and her brother are in a place where they have the capacity to petition for their freedom. Because France, even though they had slaves in the colonies, they didn't like slaves in Paris. The idea, it's amazing how people are ashamed of slavery. I mean, they're living on it, they're doing all this stuff, but they do everything to kind of try to play it down. In the Constitution, persons held to service. The French did the same thing too. They had documents, and they didn't want to put the word slave in these documents, but that's what they're doing. So they didn't want slavery in Paris, and everybody who petitioned for freedom had it granted. So they could have done that. And at some point, that's what she wants to do. When Jefferson wants to come home, he's coming home for a leave of absence. He wants to take his daughters back home and drop them off and take her as well. She doesn't want to go. At this time, she's pregnant, and she says to him, according to Madison Hemings, that she didn't want to go back, and he promises her that if she comes back with him, she would have a good life at Monticello, and any children she had would be freed when they're 21. So she accepts that. Now keep in mind, she's 16 years old. She accepts that, which is not like, I always have to say this, it's not like 16 today. I mean, a 16-year-old today I think of as a baby, right? 26-year-old people I think of as babies, you know. We're sort of extending childhood out now to, you know, to 35 or whatever. But 16-year-old, to me, is a baby, but in the 18th century would not have been. She would not have thought of herself as a baby. The age of consent in Virginia was 10 at the time, and they raised it to 12 in the 1820s. It wasn't just Virginia. It was all these states, all the states. 12 up until the 1890s was really, the 20th century is the phenomenon of higher age of consent rules. So in any event, so she buys this and comes back, and the third part of the book is something called Enthusiasts. We sort of break off and talk about Jefferson as, we talk about the plantation, we talk about Jefferson in music and Jefferson in politics, to try to explain, again, to talk about his life once he comes back, how he has been changed by France. One of the things we say is that France changes Jefferson's attitude about slavery. When he goes there, he is the person who, he writes in notes from the state of Virginia, the terrible things he says about black people, but also the things he says about slavery, that it's wrong and it will end. He also thinks that there should be emancipation, but expatriation. The liberal position at the time was blacks and whites could not live together. Blacks should be emancipated, but blacks and whites cannot live together in peace. There will be conflict and might lead to a race war. And we kind of say, you know, either laugh at that or think that that's hyperbole, but we've kind of been in a race war. I mean, some version of it for, we don't like to think of it that way, but if you think of lynching, you think of Jim Crow, you think of the violence, mass incarceration, all those kinds of things. This has not been easy. We congratulate ourselves. But if you're thinking seriously about the future of race relations, and if you're serious about understanding the divisions that existed, he knew his people. He knew himself, he knew his people, and he understood this is not going to be easy. And we still haven't figured it out. So he says this in the notes. And when he's in France, so he says these anti-slavery things, which frighten him in the sense that he thinks that this is published, people in Virginia are going to be really angry at him, and they would have been, and they were. These people thought he was going to lead a slave revolt, which is crazy, right? I mean, just from the moderate things he's saying about slavery is evil, you know, we got to stop this. But when he's in France, he sees peasants who are starving. This is pre-revolutionary France. France is about to go haywire because it's fallen apart. He sees a revolution coming, and he says it took them 1,000 years to get to this point. It's going to take us a time to get out of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to become a good slave owner. I'm going to ameliorate the situation of enslaved people. He thinks about, at one point he's thinking about, well, bringing some Germans over and mixing them with enslaved people, and then they'll basically teach them good habits or whatever, and then they will become good citizens. So then he abandons that, and then he says, well, maybe I'll plant fig trees, because figs are easy to pick, and that would be good for enslaved women. I mean, just all these crazy kinds of things, crazy to us and crazy then, to ameliorate the situation. And once you start thinking that you can become a good slave owner, that's finished. You know, that it's over. Before, he saw slavery as a state of war. Slavery is a state of war between a master and enslaved people. To go from that to, well, I'm going to be a good slave owner, that's a long way to travel. and it means that he's not going to be able to be a force, or not be willing to be a force for abolition or anything like that for the rest of his life, because he thinks he can do this well. And we also think that what happens to him is the Hemingses. This is a family that's around him. His, now his, mistress, rape victim, however you want to call it at this point, this person that he's living with, and her brothers and her sisters and all these people. And he sees himself as a slave owner through his relationship with them. But of course, his relationship with them is not, well, not real. I mean, it's not like the relationship with the people down the mountain. Good parts of the time, he didn't know where Sally Hemings' brothers were. They just sort of went off and hired their own time and worked and kept their money. And if he needed them for something, he'd say, he'd write to somebody and say, do you know where Bob is? Could you tell him to come? That kind of thing. That's not what you think of when you think of slavery. But that's just those people. So he is in the house with these people thinking, this is how I'm a slave owner. The other people, he's taking care of, but they're in the abstract. So he begins to, we think, he's deluding himself about the position that he's in. And as I said before, he is primarily fixated on the United States of America. That slavery problem is going to take care of itself. And you think about life, how many times you say, well, it's really this. That little thing over there, leave that alone. If I could just get this fixed, that will be okay. And it turns out that is the thing that is a real problem. And that's what slavery was like. That this was something that was going to take care of itself through progress. He knew Virginians were not going to vote slavery out of existence. Slavery ended in Virginia probably about the only way it was going to end. People don't give up power, don't give up property, don't give up wealth, that degree of wealth, by people just sort of asking them or trying to persuade them in sort of ways. This was it for this society. And even people who didn't own slaves had the hope of owning slaves. People who could not afford to own slaves rented slaves. You hear people say, well, not everybody owned slaves in the South. But slavery was the engine that drove Southern society. It's like saying that if you're not a homeowner, the housing market has nothing to do with you. That's not true. The housing market affects interest rates, credit, all kinds of things. And slavery was just like that. So even people who did not own slaves benefited from, were implicated in the institution, and had dealings with slaves by renting slaves, by having privilege. You may not have owned black people, but you had power over black people. And you think about what that meant to people, particularly to people who had nothing. It may have meant more to people who had nothing, to have that kind of social power, to know that there was always somebody below you that you could look down on, and somebody that you could actually order around. So he gives up this dream of, his early dream of doing something about slavery. The religious stuff, he helped with the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia, which is a precursor to the First Amendment. Education, he wanted to do something about. He wanted a public education system. The people in Virginia did not want to pay for that. And so he had to settle public education, K through 12, elementary school. Didn't want that, so he settled for starting a university, the University of Virginia, where his statue was shrouded a few days ago. That was his dream, and that's what he set himself to. And we end with the sort of final catastrophe at Monticello, because Jefferson was not very good with business. The fixation on politics, the fixation on serving in government and so forth, and he didn't really care about farming that much. I mean, people think of him as a farmer, but what he really was a builder. I mean, he's a woodworker. Madison Hemings said he had but little care for agricultural pursuits, unlike Washington. He said it was his mechanics that he spent most of his time with, mechanics meaning carpenters, and that's what he did. So he was happy to leave all the farm to his grandson, and when he did that, production at Monticello tripled. his grandson came in and started, Jefferson, Monticello is sort of like a backdrop to Jefferson. While he's sitting there, writing great thoughts, doing various things, it's a backdrop for him. It is not something that actually seized his imagination more than as a picturesque kind of thing. I planted 80 peach trees. Well, it's ornamental. It's an ornamental farm. That's what he wanted. So he ends up dying bankrupt. $107,000 in debt, people estimate. Think of $107,000 in 1826 money. That's a lot of money. That's millions of dollars. And they lose, Monticello has to be sold. They lose everything, but the people who lose the most are the enslaved people who were auctioned off to pay creditors. Now, many of those people ended up back where they were because Jefferson's grandson bought them back, and most of them were settled in the area, but still, think of the catastrophe of that. You've lived your life in a particular place. I mean, enslaved people didn't have much, but a sense of place and family and all those kinds of things mattered, and to be disrupted from that was not a trivial thing. So in the end, the patriarch, who thought that he could take care of everybody, really ended up being taken care of by other people. That was not the way it was supposed to be. That was not the way he had envisioned it. And it's a tragedy. And as I said, as much as we feel for him and his family, the enslaved people were the ones who suffered the most from that. Sally Hemings and her sons, two of her older children, leave Monticello to live as white people. And we have no idea what happened to them. We know they got married and had kids, but we don't know their descendants. The two youngest children were freed in his will, and they took their mother, and they moved into Charlottesville. In 1830, she appears in a census as a free white woman living in Charlottesville. And they did a special census in 1833 to see what African Americans, what black people, free blacks, wanted to go back to Africa. This is after Nat Turner, and they're trying to rid Virginia of free blacks. And they go around and ask, if they want to go back to Africa. And they go back to ask her, and she says, of course, no, back to Africa. And she's listed in that census as a woman of color, a Negro, freed in 1826 when Jefferson died. So there are no formal papers for her being freed. He did not free her formally. He did not free the first two children formally because, obviously they want to go live as white people. And if you have papers, then that means you were a slave, which means that you were part black, which they didn't want people to know. And Sally Hemings, to put her name in a will, we would never have done, to free her. Then you had to, if you freed somebody over the age of 45, you had to say how you were going to take care of them. So then he would have said, you had to petition the legislature to allow the person to remain in the state because slaves couldn't remain in Virginia for more than a year after they were freed. So, and he would have to say, and here's how I'm going to take care of Sally Hemings for the rest of her life. He would never do that. That's not going to happen. We could just say go. And that's what she did. And she lived in Charlottesville until 1835, and she dies, and then her two sons move out to Chillicothe, Ohio. One of them leaves to live as a white man in Madison, Wisconsin, and it is his family line that provided the blood for the DNA tests that were done the year after my first book came out. And the other one, Madison Hemings, is the one who left the recollections. He stayed in the black community, even though some of his children passed into the white community. And he's the one who tells us the story that I think, in many ways, the recollections of life at Monticello are some of the most important recollections, the important source of information about that place that we have. And we rely upon that a great deal in our book. And much of what he says has been corroborated by other means. So that's the book. That's the thing we put out there before we knew all the things that were going to happen. And I'm getting a lot of questions now because of the statue business and the monuments and all of this. And you know, is Jefferson like Robert E. Lee? You know, how do we handle this? The president, you know, talked about Jefferson in this way. So we've gotten a little bit more than we bargained for, but we're happy for the attention. So with that, I'd like to take your questions if I can. Mm-hmm.
And Jefferson, I kept thinking about how important Virginia, this section of the East Coast of the colonies was to those people. But when you started talking about the revolution, which I guess was as much selling the idea of being independent and independent country and all that, how much you find thinking about the farther reaches, New England being so different from Virginia, the south of Virginia, how those people all did or didn't interrelate or were expected to interrelate, and any thinking about that you found in your research?
Well, there's a very good book by a man named Robert Parkinson. It's called The Common Cause. It's a very long book, but it's a very good book that talks about how those groups of people, because you're right, they're very, very different. They came over to the continent for different reasons, different religion. New England, extremely religious. I mean, it's sort of interesting now you think about the South as the religious place. But then, I mean, it's New England and the Puritans. I mean, they had established churches, and they kept them even after the Revolution, in Connecticut and places. Rob talks about how they used race, actually, to bring people together. The fear of servile insurrection, even in New England, where there are not that many black people, when they first started having skirmishes, there was the threat of conflict with the Redcoats, with the British. One of the first things they think of is, what are we going to do about the black people in the town? And they were immediately frightened. So these are people that they lived with all along, but until there was a conflict, then all of a sudden, they're their potential fifth column, their potential enemies. So Rob talks about how they actually, and I think he documents it very, very well. One of the things that knit together people from New England to South Carolina, all these places, was a fear of African Americans and Native Americans too. It was the whiteness. You know, we are one people, and then there are these others who are in our midst, and the British are trying to use those people, enslaved people, because many of the enslaved people did go over to the British lines, and many of the Indians, Native Americans, fought with the British. So strangely enough, it was race that was used to pull these people together, because they're very different. You're right, very, very different interests, all kinds of things. But that was one thing that they could agree on.
Lord Dunmore became the most hated. This is back 1765. Lord Dunmore became the #1 enemy of these guys. It became Washington's enemy. And this is how Washington got where he was, in his generalship.
Dunmore, the proclamation issued that said that, you know, any enslaved of a rebel who joined the British Army would get their freedom. And, you know, that really frightened the colonists, the Virginia colonists, because they were, I mean, Virginia at the time was 40% black. If you go to, who's been to Williamsburg? Colonial Williamsburg. It's very, you know, I'm associated with it. It's a very, very tough thing to pull off, because Virginia, you know, Williamsburg was half and half. It's you think of it now as a very white place, because, you know, you don't have a lot of black people who are interested in walking around pretending to be enslaved. You know, in Williamsburg, it's hard to get the demographics right there. But so if you think about a place that in some areas like that are 50-50, or overall, 40% of the population of Virginia is black, and so at this time, so this is a real threat to them. If they team up with the British, and Native Americans. And so it's an old story. We don't seem to get out of this, pitting people against one another based upon race. But that's an easy way, a quick way to bind people, people who were very, very different in their cultures and their orientations and their religions. And you're right, Dunmore becomes the number one enemy. He's a symbol of the possibility of a sort of getting together, the British and Native Americans and black people. You in the back, you?
I was just wondering if you had a suggestion for a non-historian to read more about the economic effects of slavery on non-enslaved whites, because I thought that was an amazing point, and I just wondered sort of what we know about it.
Well, a non-academic one. That's a tough one.
Non-historian.
I mean,
I'm willing to read an academic book, but like a sort of, what's the best learning we have right now?
Well, Robin Einhorn has written a book about economics, the economics of slavery. I think Ed Baptist's book, okay, is good on that point. Let me think more about that. There's just a lot of stuff out there.
Just speaking as a writer and taking off your scholar's hat.
Okay.
To what degree do you try to think about, because that's sort of, I think, what you're doing here, think about how Jefferson would think. Maybe we would say in contemporary terms, get into Jefferson's head.
Well, you have to. I mean, that's what it is. And you try to do it based upon the things that he's written, the things that he does. I mean, I know people have a fetish for documents. Documents are important, I know. But I trust reasonable inferences from people's repeated actions over what they say. The things that people are doing over and over and over again, you can infer things from that, that these are their values. And so, yeah, it's an I say in some places it's an imaginative enterprise. That doesn't mean you're making stuff up, but you have to try to see the people in their time. And there are certain ways patterns of thought that you can discern from Jefferson. So it is kind of getting into his head. Fawn Brodie, who wrote the first book that talks about Jefferson and Hemings, she took it from a psychobiography perspective, a Freudian perspective, and I think that's a little bit different when you have a particular school of psychology that you're analyzing people through. But I think common sense observations about people's behavior and reading widely in their own writings and so forth, they give you a good idea about what you can't do it 100%. But you can get a good, reasonable idea of what he was thinking and what he would have thought. Did you have your hand up? I thought, no, sorry. Anyone else?
I like the end of your title of your book, the imagination, empire of imagination. As you know, when you think about the early part of the 19th century and this late part of the 18th century, imagination had overtones, particularly literary overtones. I wonder if you were using that word imagination in that kind of golden way that the Romantic writers.
Well, I think we were thinking about it in terms of Jefferson's vision. Jefferson is seen as a visionary, and that word was sort of a pejorative during that time, because it's, you're up there in the clouds. But we were thinking about it in terms of, he talks about America as an empire of liberty, or an empire of liberty, or sometimes empire for liberty. And what distinguishes him, I think, from a Washington or other founders at the time is that he's actually thinking very hard and seriously about the future of America. And the idea was that there would be a country from one ocean to the next. And you had to have that because you wanted the United States out of European balance of power fighting. If you have parts of the country that, you know, are just America, if you don't take all of it, the French will be in there, the Spanish will be in there, the English will be in there, and they will be fomenting, you know, dissension and problems with it. So we're thinking about his imagination, his imaginative construction of America and the future of America. Thinking, you know, in one day North America and South America will join, and they will be a bulwark against Europe. I mean, so he's sort of sitting there thinking in this way, sort of megalomania, in a way. You know, it's, to put it in a pejorative term, but it's, you know, there are people out there. There are Native Americans out there. There are other people out there. And he says of those people, he says Native Americans, he said, you know, we can marry. He can openly say, you know, Native Americans and whites can marry. Your blood will run in our veins. We'll be one people, blah, blah, blah. And we shall become one people. But he can't say that about blacks, you know. He can't, even though in his household, his sister, I mean, his wife's sisters and brothers are there, and he has his own children. But you can't, I mean, it's hard, it would be hard enough for a white politician to say that today. What white politician have you heard say, or any politician, American politician, say, we should all become one people? We should all marry. We could all be one people, but we have to have our own separate little places, right? You know, we have separate little neighborhoods, but we're one. So, but that was the problem for Jefferson, because he thought that this would be a Republican society, a society of citizens. How can you be? He thought that citizenship required. You have to be. It's a mating pool. You have to be a family. How can you say that you're equal citizens, but say, but you can't be in my family? You can't be my daughter-in-law. You can't be my son-in-law. A nation, a group of people, as I said, is a mating pool. These are people who have the capacity to form families. Because families, he thought, is the basic unit of society, and you have families up to, you know, the local, up to, you know, from the community, then the local government, and the state government, and then the federal government. It's all one big family. But he didn't know that you could, he also didn't think you could have second-class citizens. That you would have blacks here or people here, we have one tier of citizenship, and then another. Blacks had to form their own country, and then you could meet whites and blacks on a plane of equality. But here, there's always going to be strife, there's second-class citizenship, and not everybody's going to mate together. And that's it. So, but he didn't know that we could have a country where you have first-class and second-class citizenship, or we can say that we all believe that we're brothers and sisters, but we're not really going to marry each other. You know, we're not going to mix that way. That was not something he could conceive of, and that's what we've had.
There's two Jeffersons.
Oh, just two?
Look at it from.
I'm not sure.
Siri says, I'm not sure I understand that.
Two Jeffersons. There's the pre-Cotton Jefferson and the post-Cotton Jefferson. When he gets all these ideas against slavery and all these other things, there is minimum cotton in the South. About 18, 15, 16, there's cotton all over the South, and Jefferson changes in his later writings. The interesting point was there's a couple of things that I looked at where one of the ministers says, no white man can work the cotton field. And these people reply, aristocrats, and they guarantee that. I think that's really the two Jeffersons. I think he would have been fine had they not been cotton.
Well, I don't know. I think there's cotton in 1815, but I don't really know. I don't think he's really paying attention to that.
Tobacco market's gone.
Yeah, the tobacco market's gone, but he's still thinking that in 1850s, he's thinking of diffusion, this crazy idea that, well, it's not a crazy idea, but it's crazy to us. The idea is that once you buy Louisiana, and people said, don't let slavery go into that territory, although slavery was already there. I mean, the slavery was already, people act like Louisiana, that territory was empty. It wasn't. The Spanish were there, the French were there was slavery there. They would have had to have, the war would have come sooner if the federal government had said, you're getting rid of slavery there. But he thinks that you spread slaves around and it will be easier. Jefferson had a serious case of New England envy. New England had been able to emancipate, to do away with slavery because there were not that many black people in New England, right? So he thought, and others thought as well, that if they were spread around, if they were not concentrated, if you weren't in a place where there's 40% black people, it would be possible to provide for gradual emancipation. That's the theory. But of course we know that once you do that, once you get them out there into the territory, and there is cotton, and there is, sugar even down in Louisiana, then it becomes much more profitable. But this is, he's right, I think you're right. He's at the end of his life, he's beginning to see what's happening down there, but he was not that great a business. I mean, he was not economically inclined in ways. But the change on slavery becomes even before, I think, 1850. He's stepping back.
1850.
Yeah, no, but he's stepping back from that, talking about it in the 1790s. He only talks about it when people write to him and ask him something, and then he'll give his usual answer to it. But he's pulling back from that. He's fixated on the revolution, on the United States. This other thing over here, it'll take care of itself. Right now, I gotta fend off Hamilton and the Federalists and the counter-revolutionaries. That thing will take care of itself, and of course, that's the thing that destroys the country. Thank you very much.